Welcome back. Or, if this is your first time here, welcome. You're listening to Sleepy Historian, a quiet place where history slows down, details soften, and the past drifts by gently enough to fall asleep to. Tonight's story is not about battles, or kings, or sudden disasters. It is about ordinary people, people very much like you. And it is about the small, everyday behaviors that medieval society once believed were signs of madness. Not shouting, not violence, not chaos, but silence, stillness, questions, fatigue, prayer, hunger, wandering thoughts. In the medieval world, madness was not always loud. More often, it was quiet, slow, unremarkable. It lived in the gaps between routine and expectation. You see, in medieval Europe, there was no modern psychology, no clear separation between mental health, morality, spirituality, and social order. The mind was not something hidden inside the skull. It was believed to spill outward, into posture, into habits, into tone of voice, into how long you slept, how often you prayed, how quickly you answered when spoken to. To be well was to move in rhythm with everyone else, and to fall out of that rhythm, even slightly, was to invite attention. Not cruel attention, necessarily. Often it was concerned. Sometimes it was fearful, and sometimes it was simply curious. But it was attention all the same. In villages and towns where everyone knew one another, difference was easy to notice. If you sat too quietly for too long, someone would notice. If you walked the same road again and again without clear reason, someone would notice. If you laughed at the wrong moment, or cried without explaining why, someone would notice. And slowly, quietly, a question would begin to form. Is something wrong with them? Madness in the medieval mind was not always a permanent state. It could come and go. It could creep in unnoticed. It could be caused by imbalance, by sorrow, by hunger, by sin, by divine testing, or simply by exhaustion. There was no single definition. Instead, there were signs, and many of those signs were things we would barely think twice about today. In this episode, we're going to drift through a medieval day, from waking to sleeping, and notice how easily normal behavior could be reinterpreted, how the ordinary could become suspicious, how the familiar could feel unsettling, not because medieval people were foolish, but because they lived in a world where stability mattered deeply. Routine was safety. Predictability was comfort. Shared habits held communities together, and anything that pulled away from that shared pattern created uncertainty. This wasn't always cruel. Often, people believed they were protecting one another. A person showing signs of madness might be prayed for, watched over, given herbs, guided toward confession. But sometimes, those same signs could lead to isolation, whispering, or quiet avoidance. The line between concern and suspicion was thin, and most people walked it carefully. As you listen tonight, you don't need to remember names, or dates, or places. There will be no tests, no sharp turns, just slow descriptions, softly layered details, and a steady rhythm meant to let your thoughts drift. If your mind wanders, that's perfectly fine. In fact, in the medieval world, a wandering mind might itself have been considered suspicious. But here, it's welcome. You might notice your breathing slowing, your shoulders softening, your attention drifting in and out. That's exactly how this is meant to feel. Throughout this story, we won't focus on extremes. No locked towers, no dramatic trials. Instead, we'll stay with the subtle moments. A person sitting a little too still, a worker pausing too often, someone praying longer than expected, someone eating less than usual, someone staring into space, while the rest of the world moves on. These were the moments that made medieval observers uneasy, because they suggested something unseen, something internal, something that could not be measured, but was deeply felt. Madness was often imagined as imbalance. Too much heat, too much cold, too much moisture, too much dryness. But it was also imbalance in behavior. Too much talking, too much silence, too much devotion, too little engagement. The medieval world prized moderation, and anything that slipped beyond the middle ground invited interpretation. As the night goes on, we'll move gently through 4 broad areas of daily life: the body, speech and thought, religion and routine, and the quiet rhythms of work and rest. Each one will reveal how easily a person could be seen as not quite right, without ever intending to be, without even realizing it themselves. This isn't meant to frighten you. In fact, many people find these stories oddly comforting because they remind us how much gentler our modern understanding can be, and how many things we now accept: introversion, fatigue, curiosity, emotional variation, were once sources of anxiety. As you listen, you may recognize yourself in some of these behaviors: needing quiet, thinking deeply, moving slowly, feeling out of sync. That recognition isn't accidental. History has a way of holding up mirrors. But here, those mirrors are dimly lit, edges softened by time. There's nothing you need to do right now. No conclusions to draw, no lessons to learn. Just listen. Let the medieval world unfold at its own pace. Let the details wash over you, like distant footsteps on stone floors, or the low murmur of voices beyond a wall. If you fall asleep, that's perfect. If you stay awake, that's fine too. Either way, the story will continue quietly in the background. When you're ready, we'll begin with the body itself, and how something as simple as stillness could become a reason for concern. For now, just settle in, slow your breathing, and let the night carry you back to a time when even the smallest habits were carefully watched. In the medieval world, the body was never neutral. It was watched, not constantly, not harshly, but attentively. The body moved through shared spaces: fields, workshops, chapels, kitchens, and its movements were expected to match the quiet rhythm of the community. You rose when others rose. You worked when others worked. You rested when rest was allowed. And you spoke, at least a little. So when someone did not move, or did not speak, for longer than expected, it was noticed. Imagine yourself sitting on a low wooden bench, hands folded loosely, eyes resting on nothing in particular. The room is not silent. There's always sound: footsteps, breathing, the scrape of wood on stone. But you do not add to it. You do not comment. You do not react. You remain still. At first, this means nothing. Everyone grows tired. Everyone pauses. But minutes stretch, and then longer still. In medieval thinking, stillness was not automatically peaceful. It could suggest imbalance. A healthy body was believed to be active in proper measure, neither sluggish nor frantic. Stillness that lingered too long could indicate that something inside was stuck. The mind, perhaps, or the spirit. Silence carried similar weight. Speaking was not simply communication. It was proof of engagement with the world. To answer questions, to greet others, to participate in small exchanges. If you stopped doing these things, even gently, people began to wonder why. Were you tired? Were you sad? Were you deep in thought? Or were you withdrawing? Withdrawal unsettled medieval communities, not because they demanded constant cheerfulness, but because shared life depended on visibility. If someone turned inward too far, they became harder to read. And what could not be read could not be trusted. You might simply be thinking. But medieval medicine often linked excessive inwardness to melancholy, a condition believed to be caused by an excess of black bile. Melancholy was not sadness as we know it today. It was heaviness, slowness, a sinking inward. A person afflicted might sit quietly for hours, lost in thought, barely responding. And this was dangerous. Not suddenly, but slowly. Melancholy could deepen. It could harden. Some believed that if left unattended, it might lead a person to forget the world altogether. So silence was watched. A woman who no longer chatted while spinning. A man who stopped telling familiar stories. A worker who answered questions with only nods. None of this meant madness on its own, but it added weight, and weight accumulated. Stillness could also appear during prayer. This complicated matters. Prayer was encouraged. Silence before God was respected. But even devotion had limits. If you knelt too long, if your eyes remained closed after others rose, If you stayed behind in the chapel when the service ended, questions could form. Were you especially holy, or were you slipping away from ordinary life? Medieval thought struggled with this boundary, because holiness and madness were uncomfortably close. Both involved withdrawal. Both involved silence. Both suggested attention turned inward, towards something unseen. If your stillness came with downcast eyes, with a body that seemed heavy, with slow movements afterward, the interpretation shifted. You were not simply quiet. You were affected. There was also the fear of possession. Not dramatic possession, but subtle influence. A person who sat unmoving for long periods might be thought vulnerable, an empty vessel, an open door, not to demons bursting in, but to quiet spiritual disturbance. So people watched. They did not accuse. Not immediately. They observed. Did you remain still again the next day? Did your silence persist? Did you stop laughing at familiar moments? Patterns mattered more than moments. You may notice, as you imagine this, how heavy time feels here. Minutes stretch. A body that does nothing forces others to notice time passing. And time, in medieval life, was usually full. There was always something to do. Stillness disrupted that fullness. Even rest had its place. After work, after prayer, after meals. But unplaced stillness felt wrong. It did not fit. You might not even realize you were being watched. That was often the case. Concern gathered quietly. A neighbor mentioning it to another. A family member suggesting more prayer. Someone recommending herbs to warm the body, to stir the humors. The assumption was rarely cruelty. It was imbalance. Something had slowed you. And if that slowing continued, it might carry you further inward. Stillness, then, was not neutral. It was a signpost, not pointing to madness immediately, but pointing toward possibility. And once that possibility existed, it was hard to erase. As you sit with this idea now, you may feel how easily it could happen. A long night without sleep, a stretch of sadness, a desire for quiet. Nothing dramatic, just less movement, less speech. In a medieval world, that was sometimes enough. Enough to be watched, enough to be discussed, enough to gently shift how others saw you. And once seen differently, the body carried that gaze with it. Even when you finally stood, even when you spoke again, stillness left traces. If stillness raised quiet concern, restlessness raised louder questions. In the medieval world, the body was expected to move with purpose. You walked to work. You walked to prayer. You walked home. Movement had destinations. So when a body moved without clear reason, when it circled instead of progressed, attention followed. Imagine someone pacing a narrow room, back and forth, heel to toe, heel to toe. The floorboards creak, not loudly, but repeatedly. At first, this seems ordinary. Perhaps the person is thinking, perhaps waiting. But the pacing continues. It does not lead anywhere. In medieval understanding, movement without purpose suggested disturbance. A healthy body, guided by balanced humors, did not waste energy. Restlessness meant something was stirring inside. This might be excess heat, too much yellow bile, an overheated mind, or it might be agitation of the spirit. People notice patterns. A man who paced before dawn, long before work began. A woman who could not sit through a meal, rising again and again. A child who rocked constantly, even when spoken to. These behaviors unsettled others, not because they were disruptive, but because they were repetitive. Repetition mattered. One action done once was nothing. Done twice, coincidence. Done daily, it became a sign. Medieval medicine paid close attention to cycles. Just as the moon repeated its phases, and seasons returned, so too did illness reveal itself through repetition. A body that repeated movements was thought to be caught in a loop. Something inside was not resolving. Pacing could be seen as the body searching for relief, for balance, for escape. But since nothing visible caused it, the cause had to be internal. And internal causes were harder to reach. Sometimes restlessness appeared in the hands. Fingers rubbing together endlessly, cloth twisted and untwisted, beads counted again and again. Even outside prayer, hands are tools. They worked. If hands moved without working, that energy had nowhere to go. It turned inward. People might suggest simple remedies, more physical labor, cool baths, herbal teas to calm heat. But if the movement continued, interpretation shifted. Restlessness could indicate a wandering mind, a mind that could not settle, was dangerous in medieval thought. Not violent, but unstable. An unsettled mind might drift toward despair, or fixation, or false visions. The body in this view was warning others. Even sleep was examined. A person who tossed constantly, rose often during the night, or could not remain lying still, was thought to be troubled. Dreams mattered too. If someone spoke of repeated dreams, the same image returning again and again, it added to the sense of fixation. Repetition created gravity. It pulled interpretation toward illness. And then there were rituals of movement, rocking, swaying, turning in small circles. Some of these were associated with prayer, especially among the deeply devout. But outside of clear religious context, they were troubling. If someone swayed while standing alone, or rocked while sitting idle, people watched carefully. Was it prayer or compulsion? Medieval communities struggled with this line because compulsive behavior suggested loss of control, and loss of control meant the will was weakened. A weakened will could be influenced by humors, by emotions, by unseen forces. No one assumed madness immediately, but the language crept in slowly, unsettled, disturbed, not quite themselves. A person who paced too much might be advised to rest, but if rest made it worse, concern deepened. Why could the body not obey instruction? Why did it move when told to be still? This disobedience frightened people, not because they feared harm, but because it suggested separation, a gap between intention and action. In medieval psychology, that gap was dangerous. The ideal person was integrated, mind, body, spirit aligned. Repetitive motion suggested fragmentation, and fragmentation was the first step away from reason. People might begin to speak differently around you, more carefully, more softly, not unkindly, but cautiously. You might be guided rather than asked, watched rather than ignored, all because your feet moved when they were not meant to. Your hands repeated what they had already done. Your body could not settle into the expected shape of time. There's something almost gentle here. No chains, no shouting, just observation, just interpretation, and the slow accumulation of meaning. Around movements you may not even notice yourself. As you imagine this now, you may feel how thin the line was. A nervous habit, an anxious evening, a restless season. In the medieval world, these could grow heavy with significance, not immediately, but steadily, like footsteps in a hallway, heard again and again, until someone finally asks, why do they keep walking when there is nowhere to go? In the medieval world, emotion was meant to move like weather. It arrived, it passed. Joy appeared at feasts. Grief followed loss. Fear came with danger, each at its place. What unsettled people was not emotion itself, but emotion that lingered too long, or arrived without invitation. Laughter, for example, was expected, but only at the right moment. A shared joke, a celebration, a brief release after labor. Laughter was meant to rise, then settle. So when someone laughed too often, or at the wrong time, attention turned quietly toward them. A person who laughed alone raised eyebrows. A person who laughed during prayer raised concern. And a person who laughed during moments of sorrow raised fear, not because laughter was cruel, but because it broke the rhythm everyone understood. Medieval psychology valued moderation. Excess was suspicious. Too much heat, too much cold, too much joy. Uncontrolled laughter suggested inner imbalance. It might be excess blood, making the body too warm and lively. Or it might be agitation of the spirit, a sign the mind could not properly judge context. People listened carefully. Was the laughter sharp or soft? Sudden or continuous? Did it stop when addressed? A person who could not stop laughing, once it began, was seen as losing command over themselves. Loss of command was key. The mind was meant to guide emotion. If emotion ran freely, the guide was failing. Weeping followed similar rules. Tears were expected. Grief was not shameful. In fact, controlled weeping was seen as healthy. It released pressure from a heart. But like laughter, it was meant to end. Someone who cried for days, after a loss, might be pitied. Someone who cried for weeks might be watched. Someone who cried without a clear reason caused unease, especially if the tears came suddenly. A woman who began weeping during a meal. A man who cried while working in the field. A child who sobbed without injury. People asked gentle questions. What troubles you? What happened? If the answer made sense, the concern faded. But if there was no answer, or if the tears returned again and again, meaning accumulated, unexplained emotion was unsettling. Emotion without cause suggested disorder within. Medieval thinkers believed the heart and brain were deeply connected. Too much sorrow could cool the body, leading to melancholy. Melancholy was not just sadness. It was heaviness, slowness, a sinking inward. But excessive sorrow could also tip into madness, especially if it became habitual. A person who wept daily was not simply grieving. They were stuck. And being stuck, whether in movement, thought, or feeling, was dangerous. There were also emotional swings. Sudden laughter followed by tears. Joy turning quickly into despair. These changes confused observers. A stable person felt emotions steadily. Gradual change was normal. Sudden reversal suggested instability. People spoke of weak spirits or troubled hearts, not as insults, but as explanations. The idea was not punishment, but understanding. Why could this person not regulate themselves? Why did their feelings overflow? Some blamed physical causes, improper diet, bad air, lack of sleep. Others blamed moral imbalance, too much introspection, too little prayer. Excessive imagination. Imagination itself was risky. A person who dwelled too long in thought might stir emotions without cause. They might invent sorrows or laugh at inner images no one else could see. That too worried people. If emotion was triggered by something invisible, how could it be corrected? Communities depended on predictability. They needed to know how people would respond. When emotion became unpredictable, trust wavered, not violently, not openly, but quietly. People began to give space, not out of cruelty, but caution. There was also fear of contagion, not illness, but mood. Medieval people believed emotions could spread. One person's sorrow could darken a room. One person's laughter could unsettle others. Too much feeling disrupted balance. Balance was everything. A person who cried excessively might be encouraged to confess sins. Perhaps guilt weighed on them. A person who laughed too freely might be advised to fast. Perhaps their body was overheated. These were gentle interventions. But if emotion remained uncontrolled, labels crept closer. Unstable, disturbed, not right in the head, not spoken harshly, often whispered. Emotion, in this world, was evidence. It told a story about the inner state. And when that story repeated, tears without cause, laughter without reason, people listened. They did not yet think of madness as a single moment. It was a gradual separation from shared emotional reality, from laughing together, from grieving together. When someone felt alone, even among others, their emotions no longer aligned, and alignment mattered. As you drift with this thought now, notice how quiet the concern is. No shouting, no sudden judgment, just observation. Just the slow realization that someone's feelings no longer follow the expected path. And in the medieval mind, when feelings wandered too far, the mind itself might soon follow. In medieval life, speech was never neutral. Words carried weight. They moved through rooms, through relationships, through reputations. And so, how much a person spoke mattered deeply. You were expected to speak. When spoken to answer clearly, to say enough, but not too much. Silence and speech were both measured. A person who spoke too freely drew attention, not loud attention, quiet notice. Someone who filled every pause, who answered before questions were finished, who spoke when no one had asked. At first, this might be tolerated. Perhaps they were nervous, perhaps eager. But when it became a habit, meaning gathered. Medieval thinkers believed speech reflected the mind. A well-ordered mind produced ordered speech. Excessive talking suggested overflow. Too many thoughts pressing forward at once. This could be excess heat in the body, stirring the blood too quickly, or it could be agitation of the imagination. Imagination was powerful and dangerous. A person who talked constantly might be unable to restrain inner images. Words spilled out because the mind could not contain them. This was not yet madness, but it was movement in that direction. People listened not just to quantity, but to content. Did the speaker wander from topic to topic? Did they repeat themselves? Did they circle back unnecessarily? Repetition again mattered. A person who returned again and again to the same idea raised concern, especially if the idea held no clear purpose. Talking for the sake of talking was unsettling. Words were tools. They were meant to do work, to teach, to command, to explain. Idle speech wasted energy. Wasted energy hinted at imbalance. And then there was silence. Silence could be virtuous. Monks practiced it deliberately. Prayer required it. But silence outside its proper place was noticed. A person who did not answer when greeted, who avoided conversation entirely, who remained quiet even when addressed directly. At first, this might be seen as humility or fatigue, but if it persisted, interpretation shifted. Why would someone withdraw from speech? Speech connected people. Refusing it suggested withdrawal from the world. A silent person might be brooding. Melancholy often expressed itself quietly. The mind turned inward, dwelling on sorrow or imagined wrongs. A person who spoke little might be trapped in thought, and trapped thought could become distorted. Silence, when prolonged, suggested separation from others, from shared reality. Communities relied on conversation to maintain order. Instructions were given verbally. Warnings passed by word. Someone who did not speak cannot be easily guided. That worried people. Even more troubling was silence that appeared suddenly. A man who once spoke freely, now answering only with nods. A woman who stopped telling stories she once enjoyed. Change mattered more than state. Change suggested cause. Something had shifted inside. People might ask gently, "Are you unwell? Are you troubled?" If silence remained, unease deepened. There were also those who spoke in unusual ways, whispering when others spoke normally, speaking too softly to be heard, or speaking suddenly, sharply, breaking long quiet. These patterns confused listeners. Speech was meant to flow evenly. Disruption of rhythm suggested disruption of mind. Some people spoke to themselves, murmuring while alone, moving lips without sound. This was especially concerning. Speech without an audience suggested inward dialogue. With whom were they speaking? Medieval explanations varied. Some believed the person rehearsed prayers. Others feared imagined conversations. If the murmuring repeated, concern grew, especially if accompanied by gestures. A nod, a shake of the head, a whispered argument. These behaviors did not alarm immediately, but they did not fade either. They lingered, and lingering behaviors always gathered meaning. Silence and speech were judged together. Too much of either suggested imbalance. The ideal lay in between. Measured speech, responsive silence. Anything outside that narrow path invited interpretation, not condemnation. Observation. Communities watched carefully because the tongue revealed what the eyes could not see. A mind losing coherence often announced itself through words, or the absence of them. As you sit with this now, notice how narrow the expectations were, how little room there was to speak differently, to speak freely, or not at all. Every word, every pause, was part of an unspoken evaluation. And slowly, quietly, speech became evidence. In medieval society, speech was not only about what you said, but when you said it. Timing mattered. Words spoken at the wrong moment were often more troubling than words spoken incorrectly. You were expected to know when to speak. Children learned early to wait, to watch, to listen. Speaking out of turn was not simply rude. It suggested a failure to read the world correctly, and reading the world correctly was a sign of a sound mind. a person who interrupted elders, answered before being addressed, or spoke during moments of silence, was noticed. At first, this might be forgiven. Youth, nerves, excitement. But when it repeated, concern settled in. Repetition again mattered. A man who regularly spoke over others was seen as lacking restraint. Restraint was crucial. Without it, the mind appeared porous. Thoughts escaped before they were shaped. In medieval thinking, this suggested inner disorder. Words were meant to pass through judgment before reaching the tongue. If judgment failed, speech betrayed it. Even worse were words spoken in inappropriate settings. Jokes during prayer, stories during sermons, laughter at funerals. These moments unsettled people deeply, not because humor or curiosity were evil, but because they broke sacred rhythm. Sacred rhythm held society together. When someone disrupted it, others wondered why. Did they not understand the moment? Or did they understand and ignore it? Both possibilities were troubling. A failure to recognize context suggested confusion. A refusal to respect context suggested defiance. Defiance and confusion looked similar from the outside. Both pointed toward instability. Language itself carried danger. Certain words were considered heavy. Speaking openly about fear, about doubt, about despair, especially without invitation, was risky. These topics were meant to be guided carefully. A person who brought them up unprompted was thought to dwell on them too often. Dwelling mattered. Dwelling meant the mind returned, again and again, to the same place. A person who repeatedly spoke of doom, or betrayal, or hidden threats, was watched closely, not because they were wrong. Sometimes they were right, but because fixation unsettled others. Fixation suggested imbalance. It narrowed the mind's field of vision. People feared what a narrow mind might miss. There were also those who spoke bluntly, too directly, without the usual softening phrases. Medieval speech was layered. Hints mattered. Indirectness was polite. A person who said exactly what they thought, without cushioning, was considered rough. But if bluntness became habitual, it raised questions. Did the speaker understand social bonds? Or had they lost the ability to sense emotional boundaries? Loss of social sensing was dangerous. It isolated people, and isolation often preceded madness. Some people spoke truths no one wanted to hear, about illness, about death, about corruption. Truth alone was not the issue. Timing was. A person who voiced such thoughts during inappropriate moments appeared disconnected, as if living slightly out of step with everyone else. That misalignment mattered. Communities functioned because people moved together. A person out of rhythm threatened cohesion. Then there were sudden words, sharp statements, cutting through quiet rooms, outbursts without warning. Even if the words themselves were mild, their arrival startled listeners. Sudden speech suggested loss of control. Control was essential. A controlled person was predictable. Predictability brought safety. Someone who spoke suddenly introduced uncertainty. People began to brace themselves around them, not with fear, with caution. Speech also revealed hierarchy. You did not speak to superiors, as you spoke to equals. A person who ignored these boundaries was seen as confused, or worse, unable to recognize status. Inability to recognize status was serious. It suggested a distorted view of reality. Reality, in medieval thought, was structured. Everyone had a place. Failing to acknowledge that place raised alarms. Gradually, a pattern formed. The person spoke at the wrong times, used the wrong tone, ignored cues. No single incident mattered much, but together, they painted a picture, not of wickedness, not of danger, but of misalignment, a mind not quite synchronized with the world around it. And in medieval psychology, misalignment rarely stayed small. It tended to grow, quietly, steadily. As you rest with this now, you may feel how heavy words were, how silence and speech carried invisible weight. Every utterance measured, every pause interpreted. To speak differently was to risk misunderstanding, and misunderstanding, over time, could become something darker. In medieval communities, Stories were expected to have a shape, a beginning, a middle, an ending. This structure mattered more than creativity. A good story showed a good mind when someone spoke at length, but never seemed to arrive anywhere. People noticed. At first, rambling was forgiven. Nerves could loosen the tongue. Excitement could scatter thoughts. But when rambling became habitual, it unsettled listeners. A person might begin with one event, wander into another, circle back, then drift somewhere else entirely. Listeners tried to follow. They nodded. They waited. But eventually, confusion spread. Confusion was uncomfortable, not because the story was boring, but because it lacked direction. Direction was a sign of order. A mind that could not guide its own speech was suspected of deeper disorder. Especially troubling were stories that repeated themselves. The same event told, again and again, sometimes with small changes, sometimes exactly the same. Repetition without purpose felt strange. It suggested the speaker was trapped, unable to move forward. Medieval thinkers believed the mind should progress, learning, adapting, letting go. When a person returned endlessly to the same story, the same grievance, the same memory, it hinted that something was stuck. Stagnation frightened people. A stagnant mind was thought to sour. Even more unsettling were stories that blurred truth. Not lies, but distortions. Details shifted. People changed places. Timelines bent. When gently corrected, the speaker might resist or appear surprised. This resistance raised concern. Memory was sacred. It anchored identity. If memory loosened, identity followed. A person who could not keep facts aligned was thought vulnerable. Vulnerable to illusion, to fantasy, to madness. Sometimes the stories grew elaborate. Layers upon layers of explanation. Unnecessary detail. Descriptions so dense. They buried the point entirely. Listeners grew tired. Not from length, from effort. They had to work to extract meaning. Meaning should not require struggle. When it did, people suspected imbalance. There were also stories that never truly began. The speaker launched in mid-thought, assuming shared knowledge that no one else had. Listeners felt excluded, left behind. This exclusion mattered. A person who could not sense what others knew was seen as disconnected. Disconnection was dangerous. It placed the speaker outside the group. Outside thinking was often the first step toward being labeled unsound. More troubling still were stories filled with certainty, absolute conviction. Even when the claims were improbable, someone might insist. They saw signs others missed. Patterns, messages, warnings. If spoken once, it was curiosity. If spoken repeatedly, it became fixation. Fixation narrowed the mind. Narrow minds, medieval thinkers believed, slid easily into obsession. Obsession was close to madness, especially when the speaker could not be persuaded otherwise. Argument failed. Reason failed. The story remained unchanged. This rigidity worried people. A healthy mind bent. It adjusted. A rigid mind cracked. There were also moments when speech lost cohesion entirely. Sentences trailed off. Thoughts dissolved mid-phrase. The speaker seemed to forget why they were talking. Silence followed. Awkward. Heavy. People waited. Sometimes the speaker resumed, as if nothing happened. Sometimes not. These gaps frightened listeners, not because they were dramatic, but because they revealed absence. A moment where thought disappeared. Absence suggested hollowness. And hollowness, in medieval belief, invited darkness. People did not have words. Like cognitive decline, they had observation. And observation told them something was wrong. Communities responded quietly. Less conversation. Shorter replies. People stopped asking questions. Not out of cruelty, out of caution. Speech became shallow, surface level. This withdrawal isolated the speaker further. Isolation deepened the problem. Without feedback, speech unraveled faster. Stories became longer, more tangled, more insistent. A cycle formed. The speaker talked more because no one listened. No one listened because the speaker talked strangely. Eventually, labels appeared, not spoken aloud at first. Whispered, concerned. The person was said to be troubled. confused, not entirely themselves. Madness in medieval life rarely arrived suddenly. It seeped through stories told too often, through sentences that lost their way, through meanings that slipped loose. And as you rest with this now, you can feel how fragile coherence felt, how easily speech betrayed the mind. A wandering story was not just a story, it was a warning, a quiet signal that something inside was drifting out of order. In medieval life, emotion had rules, not written rules, but understood ones. People were expected to feel the right thing at the right time. Joy belonged to festivals, grief belonged to funerals, fear belonged to danger. Emotion, like speech, was meant to match the moment. When it didn't, people noticed. Few behaviors unsettled medieval observers. More than laughter at inappropriate times. Laughter itself was not sinful. It was welcomed in taverns, during celebrations, around warm fires on cold nights. But laughter carried weight. It revealed the inner state of the soul. When laughter surfaced, where solemnity was expected, it felt wrong. At a burial, laughter sounded like mockery. At a sermon, like defiance. At news of illness or death, like cruelty or worse. Madness. Medieval thinkers believed emotion flowed directly from a mind. A disordered emotion meant a disordered thought. If someone laughed, while others mourned, it suggested they did not understand what was happening, or that they understood, but could not respond properly. Both possibilities were troubling. Communities relied on shared reactions. Shared grief bonded people. Shared joy reinforced belonging. A person who reacted differently stood apart. Apart was dangerous. Sometimes the laughter was nervous. A soft chuckle, a breathy release. But even nervous laughter raised suspicion. Why was the body reacting before the mind approved? Loss of control frightened people. Control was proof of reason. Without it, a person was seen as closer to instinct than intellect. And instinct, medieval belief held, was animal. There were those who laughed suddenly, without warning, a burst of sound that startled others. This startled response mattered. It disrupted the social rhythm. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Silence followed. Silence sharpened judgment. The laughter echoed longer than it should have. People replayed it in memory. Why did they laugh then? The question lingered. Some laughed repeatedly. Short bursts, unprompted, as if something unseen had amused them. This unsettled people deeply. Laughter without cause suggested inner stimulation. Something private, something invisible. And invisible causes were often supernatural. Demons were thought to whisper jokes, to twist perception, to provoke delight. In moments meant for seriousness, a laughing person might be suspected of spiritual contamination, not possession, but influence, especially if the laughter came with vacant eyes or delayed awareness. People watched faces closely. Expression mattered. If laughter lingered, after others stopped reacting, it felt disconnected. Disconnected emotion meant disconnected mind. Children were forgiven. Adults were not. An adult who laughed wrongly was seen as regressing. Childlike, uncontrolled. Regression implied decay, a backward slide of the mind. Medieval psychology believed the mind could weaken, just as the body did, and weakened minds lost discipline. There were also cases where laughter followed tragedy, a grim story told, and someone smiled, not from cruelty, from confusion, but intention mattered less than appearance. Appearances shaped reputation. Reputation shaped survival. People began to avoid those whose emotions misfired. Not openly, quietly. They stopped sitting beside them, stopped sharing news, stopped inviting them into serious conversations. This withdrawal deepened the problem. Without correction, the person lost social feedback. They no longer learned which emotions fit which moments. Isolation amplified odd reactions. Odd reactions increased isolation. A slow, silent loop. Laughter also frightened people because it spread. One laugh could trigger another. If the wrong person laughed at the wrong time, others felt uneasy laughing too. It broke the emotional boundary. Boundaries kept society stable. A breach, even a small one, felt threatening. Some medieval writers believed excessive or misplaced laughter opened the body. Literally, they thought laughter loosened organs, released vital spirits. If laughter escaped control, so did reason. This belief made uncontrolled laughter a medical concern, a symptom, not of joy, but imbalance. Humors out of alignment, blackball disturbed, blood overheated. Medical explanations blended easily with moral ones. Either way, the verdict was similar. Something was wrong. And so laughter, a sound we now associate with lightness, became a warning sign, a sound that could exile. As you rest with this idea, notice how heavy silence once was, how carefully emotion had to be measured. A single laugh, released too early or too late, could mark someone as unsafe, as unstable, as slipping. Madness in medieval life was often quiet. It revealed itself, not in screams, but in smiles that arrived at the wrong moment. In the same way that misplaced laughter could unsettle a medieval town, so too could tears that came in excess without restraint, or in moments where restraint was expected. You might imagine a quiet village, fog rising from the river, smoke curling from low chimneys. People walk slowly along narrow streets, their boots stirring damp leaves. A sound breaks the rhythm, the soft, drawn-out sobs of someone mourning, not just once, but repeatedly, as if the grief could not find its end. To the townsfolk, this was unsettling, not because grief was unnatural, but because there were rules even for grief. The timing, the length, the manner, these all mattered. If someone wept at a sudden misfortune, people expected a pause, a composed reaction, and eventually the return to normal duties. Life did not stop entirely. For sorrow, work needed completion, bread had to be baked, livestock tended. But what of the person who could not stop, who wept long into the night, into cold streets where frost clung to hair, and their breath hung visible in the air, mixing with the smoke from the hearths? Medieval observers considered this dangerous, not immediately to the person physically, but socially and spiritually. A mind that could not restrain tears was thought to be slipping. The soul was exposed, vulnerable to external forces. Some believed demons could exploit such openness. They whispered through sadness, nudging the mind toward despair. Others saw it as imbalance within the body. Too much black bile, too heavy a heart, humors spilling over the natural bounds. You can almost feel the weight, the repetition of wet handkerchiefs, the damp air in closed rooms, the quiet murmurs of neighbors, wondering if the grief was natural or if it was a sign of something else. Weeping was contagious, too. One person crying too long could stir others into reflection, then discomfort, then fear. Communities feared emotional flooding because it destabilized social order. Yet, it was not always sorrow that provoked these reactions. Joy, when expressed without restraint, could be equally unsettling. Too much laughter, too much weeping. Both indicated that the mind was not properly aligned with the day, with duty, with expectation. Imagine sitting in the church pews, candles flickering low, listening to the priest speak. A neighbor begins to weep uncontrollably. You glance down at your hands, then at their face. Their tears flow quietly, steadily, like a stream that cannot be dammed. You feel unease, not fear for yourself, but unease at the break in order, the quiet unraveling of expected behavior. Doctors, priests, and even village elders kept notes on patterns like this. Notations in ink faded by time, scribbled in margins of manuscripts. She wept when the corn failed. She wept when the moon rose. She could not cease. Her mind wandered from the ordinary. These were warnings, not judgments. They were observations meant to protect the community. And yet, they marked the individual as different, as fragile, as slipping toward madness. You may notice how slowly time passes here. The body grows tired. The mind drifts. Yet you hear these quiet patterns. How social cohesion depended on measure emotion. how deviation invited suspicion, how survival sometimes meant holding grief just enough, and no more. In quiet corners, people practiced restraint like prayer. A single tear could be allowed, but no more. Hands pressed together, cheeks wiped swiftly, the body learning its limits, the mind learning its shape. And yet some failed. Some could not stop. Some did not wake again in the way they once had. Buried under weight they could not release. Notice how slowly the world unfolds here, like smoke rising from the hearth. The soft rhythm of life and fear, obedience and human limitation, holes at the edges of sleep. Even as it teaches, you realize that the medieval mind, watch closely, it measured subtly. Every gesture, every sigh, every soft shiver was a clue to the strength or weakness of reason. And so, the lesson lingers. Excessive weeping, like misplaced laughter, was a signal. Not always loud, not always immediate, but enough to mark a person as separate from the measured world that carried the village forward day by day through frost, smoke, and dim candlelight. Now, consider the small movements that, to the medieval observer, betrayed more than mere habit. A tapping of fingers, a repetitive step in the dust, a ritual gesture before meals. These were not merely quirks. They were markers, subtle and persistent, clues that the mind might be straying from the natural order of daily life. You might imagine yourself walking along a narrow lane at dusk, the scent of damp earth rising from the streets. A man shuffles past, his hands tracing invisible patterns in the air, or folding repeatedly over themselves, as though each repetition could anchor him, even as it unsettles you, quietly, deeply. Such behaviors were recorded in medieval texts, scribbled by watchful eyes. He spins the same mark in the dirt thrice before eating. His fingers flutter like caged wings. He cannot sit still when the moon rises. You may feel a subtle tension as you picture it. The world moves forward, measured and methodical, while some humans move in circles of their own. Ritualized, repetitive, strange. To outsiders, these gestures indicated imbalance. They were signs that the mind was struggling to maintain its connection with the ordinary, to keep up with the rhythm of village life, to perform the routines necessary for survival. Repetition served a purpose in some contexts: prayers, protective rites, or daily chores. But when the repetition extended beyond what was needed, beyond what the community expected, it suggested that something had shifted within. You might notice the subtle way that fatigue and environment amplify these movements. A long winter's evening, hands cold and stiff from labor, eyes adjusting to flickering candlelight. The body seeks its own rhythm. It taps, it folds, it rocks. Sometimes the motions are unconscious. Sometimes they're a small defiance against the weight of a world that demands order. Medieval thinkers often linked these gestures to the four humors, believing that imbalance within the body manifested outwardly. Too much bile, too much phlegm, too little blood. Each could prompt behaviors that, to observers, were strange or alarming. Yet, the person performing them often felt a strange necessity, as though the repetition offered protection or coherence against the encroaching chaos of mind and body. In quiet rooms, by flickering lamplight, the gestures repeated, drawing soft patterns in the air or on the table, echoing the rhythms of a world unseen but deeply felt. You might imagine tracing them in your mind, noticing how slowly, inevitably, the hours pass, while the patterns continue. Communities responded in measured ways. Neighbors whispered, priests noted. Sometimes corrective measures were applied. Gentle guidance, herbal remedies, ritual observances. The purpose was never cruelty. It was vigilance, a soft attention to human limits. Some did not survive the scrutiny, or the quiet isolation that resulted from being marked different. Morning did not come for everyone in the way it had before. And yet, repetition is not always destructive. Sometimes it anchors, sometimes it preserves. But the medieval eye saw both possibility and peril. each repeated motion a thread connecting the individual to the world, or unraveling it. Notice how this quiet observation teaches something subtle. Life stability depended on rhythm and control, on the alignment of mind and routine, and the restraint of gestures. Odd movements, small and almost imperceptible, could mark the boundary between ordinary life and what was considered fragile, unstable, or perhaps mad. The night deepens. Your mind may wander in and out of sleep as you picture the soft rhythm of hands, the tapping, the folding, the tracing. The medieval world is measured yet unpredictable. Every gesture is recorded in memory, whether on parchment or within the quiet consciousness of neighbors. And as you settle further into stillness, you may notice the subtle lesson lingering. Human behavior, endlessly variable, can feel strange or alarming to those who rely on measured order. The same gesture that preserves, protects, or soothes can, in the eyes of the watchful, become a sign of something quietly troubling. Time passes slowly. The frost grows heavier along the roofs. Candles burn low. Hands fold and unfold. Patterns repeat themselves, like smoke curling in still air. And through all of it, the world continues. One measured breath after another. One small, repeated motion. One faint observation, carrying the weight of human limitation and survival. Now, you move quietly into the last segment, where superstition intertwines with everyday life, and you begin to notice the invisible rules that govern the medieval mind. You are walking slowly along a narrow path just before dusk. The air is sharp with cold, and the earth underfoot is uneven. Villagers whisper as you pass, not about you, but about omens, signs, and invisible forces that dictate actions more than reason ever could. Each step you take is measured, cautious, almost ritualized, as though the world itself might respond if missteps are made. People avoided certain behaviors, quietly, as if the act of seeing or doing the wrong thing could summon misfortune. A woman might refuse to step on the threshold of her neighbor's doorway, fearing that it would bring bad luck, or a child might not whistle at night, lest unseen spirits wander closer. Even the simplest acts, turning over a bowl, spilling water, leaving shoes untied, carried weight. You might feel the rhythm of such caution in your own movements now. Perhaps you notice your hands lingering a fraction longer on the railing, or your gaze skimming the ground before taking the next step. This is the subtle endurance of medieval superstition, the constant, quiet negotiation between yourself and the unseen. Some rituals were simple, almost imperceptible, small gestures performed daily to stave off calamity. You might touch a piece of iron before entering a barn, or whisper a prayer under your breath while drawing water. You may picture the repetitive carefulness in every village, the silent choreography of caution that stretched from house to house. And then there were rituals of timing and sequence. Bread might be cut a certain way, horses led from stables in a particular order, clothing arranged just so before leaving the home. Every action measured, deliberate, protective, designed to maintain equilibrium in a world of uncertainty. Some of these practices were passed down quietly, from one generation to the next, so familiar that they were barely noticed, except when someone strayed. An unusual deviation, leaving a gate open, pouring wine before bread, sleeping with the wrong orientation, could invite whispered warnings or quiet corrections from elders. Morning did not always arrive with ease for those who ignore these customs. You may notice how subtle fear shaped endurance. It was never shouted, never immediate, but it pressed gently, consistently, like frost creeping along the eaves. Cold and inescapable if unnoticed. The body and mind adapted to it, and even the smallest routines became a survival mechanism. And yet, the medieval imagination was not cruel. These superstitions, in many ways, created structure. They offered an invisible guide to behavior, a framework for the mind to follow, when daylight logic alone might falter. By adhering to rituals and avoidances, People anchored themselves in a rhythm of cautious survival. Consider now the quiet tension in each household. Candlelight flickers on the walls. A child hesitates before stepping past a threshold. An adult touches a talisman with practiced motion. You notice the soft texture of worry, so familiar it blends with everyday life. Time moves slowly. Evening deepens. The quiet endurance of ritual is almost hypnotic, as habitual as breathing. And through this subtle, persistent caution, the medieval world maintains its fragile order. Each avoidance, each ritual, links the present to the unseen, the living to the spirits that may be near, and the individual to the collective knowledge of generations. In imagining it, you may feel a light tension in your own muscles, a faint echo of the measured care with which the past navigated daily life. And so, as night falls deeper and shadows stretch long across the village, you're left with a soft awareness. Survival was not only labor, food, or warmth. It was vigilance, quiet repetition, careful observation, and the patient adherence to rules that often made no sense, except in the subtle, enduring logic of fear and habit. Morning will come, eventually, but only for those who navigated the small rituals correctly, whose movements, gestures, and attentions followed the invisible paths, step by cautious step. Now, you drift further into the subtle currents of medieval life, where fear was never shouted, never immediate, but hung in the air like a faint fog, touching everything you did, even as the day seemed ordinary and quiet. You might imagine the villagers rising before dawn, their hands stiff from cold, their breath visible in the dim light of their homes. Every movement is guided by small precautions. A cart must be aligned just so before leaving the yard. An animal led in a careful arc around the stable. A fire tended at precise intervals. You notice, slowly, how the mind accommodates these invisible pressures. The same hands that feed, sweep, or grind grain also tremble slightly when performing an unfamiliar task. The body remembers the warnings whispered by mothers, the admonitions of elders, the silent lessons of misfortune that struck others. Even an innocent mistake could carry weight, not in immediate danger, but in quiet, accumulating consequence. Some fears were grounded in observation. A poorly timed harvest could invite famine. A neglected roof might let winter's frost inside. Yet many fears were abstract, subtle, and ritualistic. The alignment of steps, the orientation of a bed, the order in which bread was sliced, all carried imagined significance. You sense how the mind learned to weigh these subtleties constantly, like a soft undercurrent tugging at thought and attention. As you walk through this imagined village, you notice how patterns of fear shape routine. Every action is rehearsed, measured. Even conversations follow careful paths, avoiding certain topics or words that could summon trouble. Small acts of observation, eyes scanning the ground, hands brushing dust from the threshold, a whisper of prayer are quiet defenses, endurance practiced almost unconsciously. And yet, this was not oppressive in the harsh sense. It was methodical, consistent, a rhythm that sustained life. You feel it in your own imagined body now. The way your shoulders relax slightly when a step is taken correctly, and tighten when some imagined misstep occurs. Time stretches slowly. The day drags, measured by repetition, habit, and vigilance. Some influence of fear was social as well. Neighbors watched neighbors, and the quiet observance of rules ensured harmony. A glance, a gesture, a nod could convey approval or disapproval. Actions were not only measured for supernatural consequence, but for social survival, ensuring acceptance and avoiding suspicion. You can almost hear the soft, muted rhythm of steps across cobblestones, the hushed exchanges of greetings and warnings, each one reinforcing the gentle, persistent discipline of caution. And in this rhythm, you sense endurance as a form of quiet survival. Fear, carefully calibrated, shaped minds and bodies alike. It was never violent, never dramatic, yet it was pervasive, influencing choices from dawn until dusk. The air seems thicker in your imagination now, charged with unspoken rules and unseen watchers. As you walk through the streets of a village that feels at once ordinary and charged with invisible tension, time passes slowly. Hours stretch into one another. Some villagers do not awaken to the next day, not because of overt danger, but because small, cumulative pressures, neglected rituals, forgotten precautions, or chance missteps have quietly removed them from the rhythm of survival. You may feel a faint echo of this quiet endurance in your own body, a reminder that vigilance, repetition, and observation are themselves a form of protection. And so, as evening deepens and the wind whispers through narrow alleys, you notice how life, under the guidance of subtle fear, moves forward in a deliberate, measured way. The smallest gestures matter. The quietest warnings shape behavior. Time itself seems to bend around these practices, stretching the ordinary into a slow, hypnotic rhythm, where survival is embedded in every glance, every gesture, every careful step. The medieval mind, in this way, is at once fragile and resilient. Fragile because a single lapse could shift the balance of daily life. Resilient because generations learn to live within these constraints, to navigate the invisible currents of consequence and expectation, to endure through repetition, vigilance, and quiet adaptation. You may feel, in this imagined moment, the soft weight of endurance pressing against your own attention, slowly, steadily, persistently, like the invisible fog of superstition and caution that clings to every stone, every shadow, every breath. And as night settles completely, you find yourself immersed in the subtle textures of survival, the soft interplay of fear, habit, and observation, where each day is neither triumphant nor tragic, but a measured navigation of possibilities, an endurance of the ordinary, which for the medieval world was nothing short of remarkable. Now, as the day fully darkens into night, you move through the final stretch of medieval thought, where myths once whispered in corners of the mind persist quietly into ordinary routines. You imagine the villagers gathered near hearths, the glow of embers casting gentle shadows across stone walls. Some stories are told aloud, others only half heard, slipping between the rhythm of daily chores and the hush of evening. Even the youngest may sense, without question, that certain behaviors carry unseen weight. To hum too loudly, or to speak a forbidden phrase, might ripple unseen consequences through the household. These myths are not fantastical spectacles. They are subtle currents guiding thought, shaping action. A belief that a certain posture invites misfortune, or that a glance in the wrong direction could summon attention, moves through daily life quietly, like a slow wind over the thatched roofs. You notice how repetition turns caution into habit, and habit into endurance. The line between superstition and routine blurs, and the body follows without the mind needing constant vigilance. Some myths endure because they offer explanation, however imperfect, for events beyond control. A sudden illness, a lost harvest, the disappearance of an animal, all find explanation in the patterns of myth. You sense how these quiet narratives, often simple and repetitive, anchor communities, giving structure to uncertainty and, paradoxically, offering comfort amidst pervasive unease. You may feel now how the rhythms of belief and habit extend into small daily gestures. A carefully arranged fire, a prayer muttered before sleep, the careful alignment of tools, the silent counting of steps. Each act is a bridge between the known and the unknown, between control and surrender. Even when reason might suggest no danger, the body continues in learned patterns, guided by ancestral caution and the quiet echo of stories long told. Time stretches slowly in this imagined world. You may notice how your own attention mirrors it, drifting between the rhythm of action and reflection, between awareness of myth and awareness of your own body. The evening deepens. The air feels colder, the stone walls heavier. You sense how endurance is measured not in heroism, but in continuity, in the quiet persistence of routines, shaped by generations of careful, observant living. These myths leave legacies beyond immediate survival. They inform patterns of thought, subtle hierarchies of attention and observation, the ways in which people anticipate consequence. And though you now observe these legacies from a distance, their effect is tangible. The villagers' hands, eyes, and posture, their very breathing, are shaped by centuries of accumulated caution. Some do not wake again, not to catastrophe, but to the quiet erosion of stamina, luck, or circumstance. Others endure, moving slowly through familiar patterns, their survival as much a product of habit and attention as of luck or skill. As you linger in this imagined moment, you perceive the weight of time stretching across centuries, where each belief, each caution, each repeated gesture carries forward a thread from distant generations. The medieval mind is a quiet map of enduring truths and imagined dangers, a world where ordinary behavior is laden with significance, where the rhythm of life itself is a practice in endurance. And so, as the hearth dims and shadows gather, you find yourself in the final hours of this imagined day, immersed in the subtle persistence of human thought, where myths guide habits sustain, and endurance, in its slowest, quietest form, becomes a defining force. The night is complete now, and you may feel the weight of all that has passed before you. The ordinary, the feared, the imagined, and the quietly remembered is not triumphant. It is not tragic. It is measured, deliberate, a meditation on the endurance of mind and body alike, where history's quiet currents flow through every step, every breath, every silent thought. You settle now into the final hours of this long journey, the quiet echo of medieval lives stretching softly around you. Perhaps you feel the slow rhythm of time itself, its weight pressing gently against the shoulders, its length measured not in events or triumphs, but in the endurance of ordinary, unremarkable days. Imagine the villages now, sleeping under roofs of thatch and timber, their occupants wrapped in blankets, the hearths reduced to smoldering embers, and the wind whispering through the streets, like a voice that has long been waiting, to remind you of the persistence of life. The cold does not rage, it simply lingers, a subtle pressure that teaches attention, teaches habit, teaches caution, without drama, without alarm. In these quiet streets, you see the consequences of centuries-old myths. Small traces in the ways people bend, pause, look twice before acting, each movement measured, deliberate, intentional. Even as their stories fade, the patterns remain, like soft marks etched into stone, that survive the passage of years without fanfare. You reflect on the endurance that shaped these lives, not heroic in the sense of battles or great victories, but heroic in the slow, patient maintenance of life itself. Routines, gestures, habits, all become instruments of survival. Small acts performed again and again, to navigate a world both harsh and unpredictable. The quiet endurance of the body mirrors the quiet endurance of belief. And in both, there is a peculiar grace, an understanding that life persists, even when awareness drifts and focus wanes. And now, as you lean back in your own chair, perhaps with a blanket drawn close, perhaps with the subtle night sounds outside your window, you notice a parallel. Your own mind, moving slowly through this narration, mirrors the endurance you have observed, a gentle drifting between awareness and rest, between curiosity and surrender, between understanding and the quiet acceptance of mystery. Some truths of medieval life are simple, others obscure. Some are believed without question, others only half glimpsed in the flickering firelight. Yet all of them left marks, shaping thought and habit, shaping the rhythms of ordinary days. You may feel, in these moments, a calm connection across centuries, as if the lessons of caution, patience, and endurance have quietly reached forward to touch your own thoughts. There is no sudden clarity here, no tidy resolution, no dramatic uplift. The world does not change in the span of a single night. Instead, you are left with a gentle understanding, a calm acceptance of continuity, and the sense that endurance, in its quietest form, is a companion to all who came before, and all who continue on in lives measured by routine, by habit, by subtle observation. Breathe slowly now, letting the air move gently in and out, letting the mind drift across centuries, through shadows, cold, firelight, through villages and hearths, through the quiet lives of those who lived, without fanfare, without hurry, without expectation of notice. You feel the soft rhythm of life in all its forms, the persistence of body, a belief, the accumulation of small, repeated actions that together carry forward the weight of ordinary survival. And in this gentle, reflective state, you are free to let go of expectation. There is no climax, no final revelation. There is only the soft, steady pulse of history, the quiet endurance of generations past, and the echoing rhythm that has, for centuries, carried human thought and human habit through the long, slow stretch of time. Some did not wake again, and some endured, and through both, the quiet truth persists. That life, in its most ordinary, measured form, demands patience, observation, and endurance. It asks nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, only that you move gently through its rhythms, that you notice the patterns, and that you allow yourself to rest in the understanding, that you, like they, are part of the slow, enduring current that flows through human history. So let your breathing slow further. Let the images of hearth and village fade gently. Let the cold, the wind, the muted shadows become companions in this final moment. This is the quiet meditation that history offers, the soft, unassuming gift of perspective, and the calm understanding that comes from observation, reflection, and the patient endurance of the human spirit. And as you drift, aware yet unburdened, let this knowledge settle softly. That endurance is not only measured in survival, but in the quiet accumulation of days, the rhythm of ordinary thought and habit, and the soft, persistent echo of human life that stretches far beyond the reach of immediate perception. Good night, and may your rest be as steady, calm, and enduring as the lives you have traveled alongside tonight.